This is a reading from the book entitled Purgatory, explained by the Lives and Legends of the Saints by Father F. X. Shoup, S.J. Chapter 20. Relief of the Souls through the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. Saint Teresa and Bernardino de Mendoza. Multiplicity of Masses. Pomp of the Obsequies. Let us conclude what we have said relative to the Holy Sacrifice by what Saint Teresa relates concerning Bernardino de Mendoza. She gives this fact in the Book of Foundations, chapter 10. On the Feast of All Souls, Don Bernardino de Mendoza had given a house and a beautiful garden, situated in Madrid, to Saint Teresa, that she might found a monastery in honor of the Mother of God. 2 months after this, he was suddenly taken ill and lost the power of speech, so that he could not make a confession, though he gave many signs of contrition. He died, says Saint Teresa, very shortly afterwards, and far from the place where I then was. But our Lord spoke to me and told me he was saved, though he had run a great risk, that mercy had been shown to him because of the donation to the convent of his Blessed Mother, but that his soul would not be freed from suffering until the first Mass was said in the new house. I felt so deeply the pains this soul was enduring that although I was very desirous of accomplishing the foundation of Toledo, I left it at once for Valladolid on St. Lawrence's Day. One day, whilst I was in prayer at Medina del Campo, our Lord told me to make all possible haste, for the soul of de Mendoza was a prey to the most intense suffering. I immediately ordered the masons to put up the walls of the convent without delay, but as this would take considerable time, I asked the bishop for permission to make a temporary chapel for the use of the sisters which I had brought with me. This obtained, I had Mass offered, and at the moment I left my place to approach the holy table, I saw our benefactor, who, with hands joined and countenance all radiant, thanked me for having delivered him from purgatory. Then I saw him enter heaven. I was the more happy as I did not expect this. For although our Lord had revealed to me that the deliverance of this soul would follow the celebration of the first Mass in the house, I thought that it must mean the first Mass when the Blessed Sacrament should be reserved there. This beautiful incident shows us not only the efficacy of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, but also the tender goodness with which Jesus interests himself in favor of the holy souls, even condescending to solicit our suffrages in their behalf. But since the divine sacrifice is of such value, it may here be asked if a large number of Masses procures for the souls more relief than a small number whose defect is supplied only by magnificent obsequies and abundant alms. The answer to this question may be inferred from the spirit of the Church, which is the spirit of Jesus Christ himself, and the expression of his will. Now the Church advises the faithful to have prayers said for the dead, to give alms, and perform other good works, to apply indulgences to them, but especially to have Holy Mass celebrated, and to assist thereat. Whilst giving the first place to the divine sacrifice, she approves and makes use of various kinds of suffrages, according to the circumstances, devotion, or social condition of the deceased or his heirs. It is a Catholic custom religiously observed from the remotest antiquity to have Mass celebrated for the dead with solemn ceremonies and a funeral with as much pomp as their means will allow. The expense of this is an alms given to the Church, an alms which, in the eyes of God, greatly enhances the price of the holy sacrifice and its satisfactory value for the deceased. It is well, however, so to regulate the funeral expenses that a sufficient sum be left for a certain number of Masses, and also to give alms to the poor. That which must be avoided is to lose sight of the Christian character of funerals, and to look upon the funeral service less as a great act of religion than a display of worldly vanity. What must be further avoided are the profane mourning emblems which are not conformable to Christian tradition, such as the wreaths of flowers with which, at a great expense, they load the coffins of the dead. This is an innovation justly disapproved by the Church to which Jesus Christ has entrusted the care of religious rites and ceremonies, not excepting funeral ceremonies. Those of which she makes use at the death of her children are venerable by their antiquity, full of meaning and consolation. All that presents itself to the eyes of the faithful on such occasions, the cross and the holy water, the lights and the incense, the tears and prayers, breathe compassion for the poor souls, faith in the divine mercy, and the hope of immortality. What is there of all this in the cold wreaths of violet? They say nothing to the Christian soul. They are but profane emblems of this mortal life, that contrast strangely with the cross, and which are foreign to the rites of the Catholic Church. Chapter 21. Relief of the Souls. Prayer. Brother Corrado do Fida, the golden fishhook, and the silver thread. After the holy sacrifice of the Mass, we have a multitude of secondary, though most efficacious means of relieving the holy souls, if we employ them with spirit, faith, and fervor. In the first place comes prayer in all its forms. The annals of the seraphic order speak with admiration of Brother Corrado do Fida, one of the first companions of St. Francis. He was distinguished by a spirit of prayer and charity, which contributed greatly to the edification of his brethren. Among the latter there was a young monk whose relaxed and disorderly conduct disturbed the holy community. But, thanks to the prayers and charitable exhortations of Corrado, he entirely corrected himself and became a model of regularity. Soon after this happy conversion he died, and his brethren gave him the ordinary suffrages. A few days elapsed, when Brother Corrado, being in prayer before the altar, heard a voice asking the assistance of his prayers. "Who are you?" said the servant of God. "I am," replied the voice, "the soul of the young religious whom you reanimated to fervor. But did you not die a holy death? Are you still in so great need of prayers?" "I died a good death, and am saved, but on account of my former sins, which I had not the time to expiate, I suffer the most terrible chastisement, and I beseech you not to refuse me the assistance of your prayers." Immediately the good brother prostrated himself before the tabernacle and recited a pater, followed by the Requiem Aeternam. "O my good father," cried the apparition, "what refreshment your prayer procures for me! Oh, how it relieves me! I entreat you to continue." Corrado devoutly repeated the same prayers. "Beloved Father," again repeated the soul, still more, still more. I experience such great relief when you pray." The charitable religious continued his prayers with renewed fervor, and repeated the Our Father 100 times. Then, in accents of unspeakable joy, the deceased soul said unto him, "I thank you, my dear Father. In the name of God I am delivered. Behold, I am about to enter the kingdom of heaven." We see by the preceding example how efficacious are the smallest prayers, the shortest supplications, to alleviate the sufferings of the poor souls. "I have read," says Father Rossignoli, "that a holy bishop, wrapped in ecstasy, saw a child who, with a golden fishhook and a silver thread, drew forth from the bottom of a well a woman who had been drowned therein. After his prayer, and whilst on his way to the church, he saw the same child praying at a grave in the cemetery. 'What are you doing there, my little friend?' he asked. 'I am saying the Our Father and Hail Mary,' answered the child, 'for the soul of my mother, whose body lies buried here.' The prelate immediately understood that God had wished to show him the efficacy of the most simple prayer. He knew that the soul of that woman had been delivered, that the fishhook was the pater, and that the Ave was the silver thread of that mystic line." Chapter 22. Relief of the Holy Souls. The Holy Rosary. Father Nierenberg, Mother Francis of the Blessed Sacrament, and the Rosary. We know that the Holy Rosary holds the first place among all the prayers which the Church recommends to the faithful. This excellent prayer, the source of so many graces for the living, is also singularly efficacious in relieving the dead. Of this we have a touching proof in the life of Father Nierenberg, whom we have mentioned elsewhere. This charitable servant of God imposed upon himself frequent mortifications, accompanied by devotions and prayers for the relief of the poor, suffering souls. He never omitted to recite the Rosary each day for their intention, and gained for them all the indulgences in his power, an offering which he recommended to the faithful in a special work which he published on this subject. The chaplet which he used was ornamented with pious medals and enriched with numerous indulgences. It happened one day that he lost it, and he was inconsolable. Not that this holy religious, whose heart was not fettered by anything upon earth, had any material attachment to these beads, but because he saw himself deprived of the means of procuring the relief he was accustomed to give to the poor souls. He sought everywhere, tried to recollect where he could have put his precious treasure. All was useless, and when evening came, he found himself obliged to replace his indulgence chaplet by ordinary prayers. Whilst thus engaged and alone in his cell, he heard a noise in the ceiling, like that of his beads, which was well known to him, and raising his eyes, he saw in reality his chaplet, held by invisible hands, descending towards him and fall at his feet. He did not doubt that the invisible hands were those of the souls who were relieved by this means. We can imagine with what renewed fervor he recited his accustomed 5 decades, and how much this wonder encouraged him to persevere in a practice so visibly approved by heaven. Venerable Mother Frances of the Blessed Sacrament, footnote 1, sa vie par le Père Joachim, see also Rossignoli Merveille 26, had from her infancy the greatest devotion towards the suffering souls, and persevered therein as long as she lived. She was all heart, all devotion towards those poor and holy souls. To assist them, she daily recited her Rosary, which she was accustomed to call her almoner, and she ended each decade with a requiescant in pace. On feast days, when she had more free time, she added the office of the dead. To prayer she joined penances. The greater part of the year she fasted on bread and water, and on vigils she practiced other austerities. She had to endure much labor and fatigue, pain and persecution. All these works were turned into profit for the holy souls, Frances offering all to God for their relief. Not content with assisting them herself, as far as was in her power, she engaged others to do the same. If priests came to the convent, she begged for masses for them. If they were laymen, she advised them to distribute abundant alms for the faithful departed. In recompense for her charity, God frequently permitted the souls to visit her, either to solicit her suffrages or to return her thanks. Witnesses have testified that several times they visibly waited for her at the door when she was going to the office of matins, that they might recommend themselves to her prayers. At other times they entered her cell in order to present their request to her. They surrounded her bed, waiting until she awoke. These apparitions, to which she was accustomed, caused her no fear, and that she might not think herself the sport of a dream, or a dupe of the devil, they said on entering, "Hail, servant of God, spouse of the Lord, may Jesus Christ be ever with you." Then they testified their veneration for a large cross and the relics of the saints which their benefactress kept in her cell. If they found her reciting the Rosary, add the same witnesses, they took her hands and kissed them lovingly as the instrument of their deliverance. Chapter 23. Relief of the Holy Souls. Fasts, penances, and mortifications, however trifling. A glass of cold water. Blessed Margaret Mary. After prayer comes fasting, that is to say, not only fasting properly so called, which consists in abstaining from food, but also all penitential works, of what nature soever they may be. It must here be remarked that this is a question not only of the great austerities practiced by the saints, but of all the tribulations, all the contradictions of this life, as also of the least mortifications, the smallest sacrifices which we impose upon ourselves or accept for the love of God, and which we offer to His divine mercy for the relief of the holy souls. A glass of water, which we refuse ourselves when thirsty, is a trifling thing. and if we consider this act in itself, we can scarcely see the efficacy it possesses to alleviate the sufferings of purgatory. But such is the divine goodness that it deigns to accept this as a sacrifice of great value. If I am permitted, says the Abbé Louvet, speaking of this subject, I will relate an example which came almost under my own personal experience. One of my relations was a religious in a community which she edified, not by that heroism of virtue which shone forth in the saints, but by an ordinary virtue and great regularity of life. It happened that she lost a friend whom she had formerly known in the world, and from the time she heard of her death, she made it her duty to recommend her to God. One evening, being very thirsty, her first impulse was to refresh herself with a glass of water, this being allowed by her rule. But she remembered her deceased friend, and for the benefit of her soul, refused herself this little gratification. Instead, then, of drinking this glass of water, which she held in her hand, she poured it out, praying to God to show mercy to the departed. This good sister reminds us of King David, who, finding himself with his army in a place without water and oppressed with thirst, refused to drink the refreshing water which was brought to him from the cisterns of Bethlehem. Instead of raising it to his parched lips, he poured it out as a libation to the Lord, and Holy Scripture cites this act of the Holy King as one most agreeable to God. Now, this slight mortification which our holy religious imposed upon herself by denying herself this draught of water was so pleasing to God that he permitted the departed soul to make it manifest by an apparition. On the following night she appeared to the sister, heartily thanking her for the relief she had received. Those few drops of water, which, in the spirit of mortification, she had denied herself, were changed into a refreshing bath to temper the heat of purgatorial fires. We wish to remark that what we here say is not restricted to acts of supererogatory mortification. It must be understood of obligatory mortification, that is to say, of all that we have to undergo in the fulfillment of our duties, and in general to all those good works to which our duties as Christians or those of our particular state of life oblige us. Thus, every Christian is bound by virtue of the law of God to refrain from wanton words, slander, and murmuring. Thus, every religious must observe silence, charity, and obedience as prescribed by the rule. Now, these observances, though of obligation, when practiced in the true spirit of a Christian, with a view to please God, in union with the labors and sufferings of Jesus Christ, may become suffrages and serve to relieve the holy souls. In that famous apparition where Blessed Margaret Mary saw the deceased religious suffering intensely for her tepidity, the poor soul, after having related in detail the torments which she endured, concluded with these words, "Alas, 1 hour of exactitude in silence would cure my parched mouth. Another passed in the practice of charity would heal my tongue. Another passed without murmuring or disapprobation of the actions of the superior would cure my tortured heart." By this we see that the soul asked not for works of supererogation, but only the application of those to which the religious are obliged.